Hello and welcome. This video is for you if you're looking to get started with watercolour, and especially if you're looking for permission to play. My name's Lou, and on this channel I share lots of art projects and tutorials, many of them involving watercolour, and I love sharing beautiful, simple, creative ideas for using this fabulous medium. So for the purposes of this video, I'm starting with a brand new set of watercolours, just getting it straight out of the box. Now this happens to be a set of 12 colours, and they're from the brand Winsor and Newton. This is their Sketchers set, and most of these watercolours are from their Cotman range. They've got different ranges at different price points, but I'm not worrying too much about that for now. All I want to do is get started. So I'm unwrapping all of these paints, and they are a little bit fiddly. They've got a plastic wrap and a paper wrap, and it's very tempting to throw those papers away, but I'm going to keep hold of them for now, just because each of the pans has written on the side what it is. But once I put it into the palette, it's really hard to see that, and at the minute you might not really care too much what the colours are called, what pigments are, any of the technical information that's on that label. But it's a good job to keep hold of it, because if you want to replace any, you'll find it really useful. Keeping hold of the labels also tells me things like that in this set there was a special professional series watercolour in the colour French Ultramarine, which I'll want to know, again, if I use it all up and I want to replace it down the line. Now this palette comes with a little handy travel brush. You just pop the top off, and then, like all new brushes that you get, it's got a kind of gum coating on the bristles. So I just need to soften them up before I start using it, and it's ready to go. But this one's quite a small brush, and while it can be really good to have something very small and handy, and especially to keep it with the sketching set, for this I want something a little bit bigger. So here I've got a selection of some of the watercolour brushes that I've got and that I use on a daily basis. But if you're just starting out, you don't need to have all of these. What I'd recommend is buy one, maybe two, brushes a bit like this. Ones that are round in profile and that come to a nice sharp point. You can see I've got them from different brands and they come in different sizes. They all have a number on the side that tells you what size they are. And I think about a 7 or an 8, somewhere between a 7 and a 10 is a good all-rounder. I've also got some other brushes that are different shapes. These ones are kind of flat in profile and they come to a square tip, but you don't need to worry about having all of these to start with. Just pick one or two and give them a try and see how you get on with them. You'll also need something to paint on, and I've got a whole variety of different types of watercolour paper here. Some of them are on pads like this one, where it's gummed down one edge. And I quite like these big pads of paper, especially when you're getting started, because it means you don't need to be precious about them. Or you could use a watercolour sketchbook, like this one, which is a nice little square one that I've been using recently. This one's got cotton pages, which I feel really makes a difference to the quality of the painting that you do. You could use a watercolour block like this one, which is where the paper is gummed on all four sides. But be aware, with this brand, the top sheet is black. I thought I'd bought the wrong pad the first time, but no. You just need to slide in a thumbnail or something that's kind of sharpish but not very sharp, pull the top page off, and then you're ready to paint. The benefit of a block is that your paper stays nice and flat, and no matter how much water you add, you shouldn't get too much buckling, which can be a problem when you're painting on a pad or sketchbook, or what I like to do most often these days, paint on individual sheets of paper. You can buy watercolour paper in big sheets and then use a metal ruler to tear it down to size, or a knife to cut it. I like doing this because it means that I can make the paper whatever size I want it to be, and it works out slightly cheaper. Before I start playing, I'm going to do a little bit more setting up. And I'm going to create myself a little colour swatch card that I'll keep with my palette, just to give me a reference of what the colours are, because they can look very different on the paper than they do in the pan. So I've cut myself a piece of watercolour paper to the right size and marked a grid in pencil. And then I want to add lots of water. So I get my brush nice and wet. So there are drops of water pretty much falling off the end of the brush. And then I'll take those drops of water and place them carefully, one at a time, on my dry watercolour pans. The longer you can let that water sit on the surface of the paint, the juicier and easier it will be to get the colour off. And to make my swatch card, I'm just taking my slightly damp brush, drying it off if I have to, and then mixing it with that juicy watery paint mixture that's sitting on the top of the pan, and just paint a little puddle of it. You can be really neat if you want, but I'm more concerned about getting the colour on there. Because I'm making a swatch card, I'm being really careful to wash out my brush and dry it off each time to make sure there's none of the previous colour on there. It's possible that if you buy a new set of watercolours, you might not get pans, you might get little tubes like this set here. These are the core watercolours, and this is the high Chroma set that I bought last year. You can see that I have used it. This set has a nice little lid that I can use as a palette, but if you don't, then a plate or any non-porous surface will work just fine. You don't need to clean your palette off every time you've used it. And especially not with these tube paints, you might end up wasting a lot. So instead, leave your paints to dry on the palette. And then next time you want to use them, you can just add a little bit more water, like I am here with these ones that I've already squeezed out onto this plate. If you're using tube paints, you'll want to add a little bit of water to them to get them flowing, because straight out of the tube they can be a little bit too thick to paint with. And then the thing that I like to do when I've got a brand new set of paints is just to get some paper and play. I'm not aiming for anything in particular. I'm just wanting to see what the colours do, how they behave. What shapes and marks can I make? And I'm just giving myself permission to try all of these colours, to smoosh them into one another, to blend them in together, and just move them around on the page and see what happens. So that's what I'm going to do for my brand new unboxed set of paints. I'm just going to start by taking each colour one at a time and making a few marks onto the surface of my paper. You can take the paint straight from the pan with all that juicy water sitting on top of it, or you can add it into the palette, and that allows you to control how much water you're putting in. You can have it really dilute or much stronger. And you can have a play with mixing colours as well. Take two colours from the pans and put them on the palette together. Mix them in and see what kind of colours you can get. I want to play with my brush as well, work out what kind of marks and shapes I can make. Here I'm scrubbing a really dry brush on the page to see what kind of textures I can make. You can do swipes, swooshes, dabs, dots, anything you can think of. I can see what happens also when I just add in water straight from my jar into an area of wet paint and watch the paint swoosh into that wet area. I can try scribbling with my brush, going into and over areas that I've already painted. Now, I didn't plan to do this, but I seem to be working through this in rainbow order, going from the yellows through the oranges to the pinks and now the purples. And I'll probably keep that going to the end of the page because I quite like that look. but I do think I want to try all of the colours, including those brown and neutral colours as well, so make sure that I kind of at least use them somewhere in there. As I get to the bottom of the page, I've got to that limey green, and I think it would be a good idea to kind of complete the loop and just dot a little bit into the yellow at the top. And then a few token dabs of brown into the colours where they kind of match the best, so the brown into the orange, and then the white, just to see what it does. This paint's still wet, so it's gonna run through that paint. Create little clouds of a paler colour in there. I'm not very good at keeping my colours nice and clean and separate when I'm mixing. I have a tendency to go from one colour right into the next and make a mess of it like this. But it's not the end of the world, you can always clean it. I'll need a nice clean paintbrush for this, so I'm going to give it a wash, and then it needs to be fairly dry, so I'm just going to use a paper towel or a rag to take off any excess water, and that will allow the paintbrush to pick up paint from that surface. Make it nice and clean again. There are lots of different ways you can play with your watercolours. In the last project it was all free form and just playing with squiggles and stripes and dots, and this one is a much more regimented one where I've created a grid in pencil of squares, and then I'm just using the paints to fill in the squares. I'm starting by using just the paint straight from the pans, just to see what they look like on their own. But then I'm going to try mixing some colours too. And you could do this in a really ordered way. Make notes of which colours you're using and what proportions and quantities you're using them in. But for this, I really want to focus on playtime, so that's going to take away from my play. So I'm just going to go for it and see what I get. And I've mixed the blue and the pink together to create a really lovely purple here. Once I've got a few mixes of two colours together, I can mix a third colour in. So to that mix of pink and blue, I'm adding some yellow, and it gives me a brown. That's not a surprise, but I can change the tone of the brown by adding more quantities of those different colours in there. So I'll try and change it and give myself two different options from those same three colours. If your palette is full and you want to create a new colour mix in one of the wells, you can clean it out while it's still wet, just by using a bit of paper towel or a rag. That will clean that area out, and then you can make a new colour mix in there. I'm going to keep going, adding colours and adding colour mixes until I filled every square on this page, and making sure that I've used one of every colour in this palette in at least one mix. As you're painting, you can give yourself challenges to use colours that you don't particularly like, or to mix up a particular shade of a particular colour. I'm really quite enjoying kind of plums and olive greens at the minute. So I want some nice vintage pinks and some soft and olivey greens and some slaty greys. I want to see how I can make those out of this set of colours that I've got here. I also want to play with water, the amount of water that I'm using, and I want to see what happens if I add a lot of water. A lot of these experiments in play are just about thinking of a question and saying, I wonder what happens if I do that, and then finding an exercise to try it out. With this, I'm starting with the ultramarine blue, and I'm adding a lot of water to it, and more water as I go further and further across the page. And then I'll try the same thing out with some other colours. This is this lovely deep rich purple. When I did my colour grid, this was by far the darkest colour in this palette. So I think I get a really big difference between the dark and the light by adding lots of water to it. So that's why I'm trying this one. Now I'm using this beautiful pink, and I'm going to see how much I can stretch this colour just by using water and pulling it across the page. And finally I'm using this sky blue, and to break things up a little bit I'm just using some dabs of my brush to apply the colour, and then I will of course add more water as I go further along. I think I'm going to be most interested to see what this one looks like when it's dry, because I think it'll make a big difference putting all this water on here. So let's have a look at the dry results, and I'll show you how all my projects turned out. This is my water exercise, and you can see the effects of using lots of water here. I've got some really interesting marks where the paint's dried in uneven ways. You can see that I get that more with that cerulean blue and the pink that I've got at the bottom of the page than I do at the top with the ultramarine. You can also see that the ultramarine has dried with lots of granulation, which is that kind of lovely textured surface you get. And this is my colour grid, where I've got some really bright and vibrant colours that are the colours pretty much straight from the pans. The colours where there's a couple mixed together, and then the ones where are three mixed together, I've got lots of neutrals, lovely kind of soft browns and olive greens, and those kind of lovely vintage pinks. This really helps me to know that if there's a colour that I really like, I should be able to mix it from this palette. I should be able to find a combination of colours that will help me to get there. And then these are my two first play sessions with the paints from those two different palettes. The one on the left is the Cotman set, and then the one on the right is the core watercolours. The Cotman colours look a little bit more pale and faded, but I think that's because I used a lot of the white at the end, and that's kind of blended in and made them look more soft and pastel-y. But you can see there's not that much difference between them. They're all really bright and vibrant. I think the big difference here is the cotton paper that I used, which allowed the colours to stay wet for much longer and allowed them to blend in together. So I haven't got really any of those watermarks like I had on the water experiment, where you saw all of those kind of like harsh lines in the watercolour when it dried. So on this channel you'll find a lot more inspiration for watercolour painting. From simple mark making and pattern making challenges, to projects that are a little bit more advanced. I'll give you lots of ideas for painting that's mindful, simple, beautiful, detailed. And I hope that you'll find something that inspires you and something that you'll enjoy painting. So I wish you well on your watercolour journey, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, bye bye.